Hello and welcome to yet another impactful edition of Beyond the Hype with Black Enterprise. I'm your host, Senior Vice President and Executive Editor at Large for Black Enterprise, Alfred Edmond Jr. And this edition of Beyond the Hype is being brought to you by Hyatt Hotels. Listen, you know that one of the major ongoing conversation topics on Beyond the Hype since 2020, the year this show was actually created and birthed, has been the tipping point, what has happened in corporate America since the tipping point of the murder of George Floyd. We saw in the very beginning major pronouncements, programs and initiatives, some from companies that already had a long track record in diversity and inclusion, others that were coming new to the table with a sense of urgency because of what was going on in 2020 during the pandemic. Since then, we've been in multiple conversations with experts in this field and asking the question, what does a commitment to DEI look like? Which companies are really setting the standard for that? And what do African Americans and the Black enterprise audience look for as consumers, as potential employees, as suppliers? What do we look at when we're looking at this standard if we are in agreement that this is a critical measure of corporate performance and corporate contributions to the success of the company, the success of the markets it serves, and of course, to the Black community that Black enterprise serves? Listen, we could not have a better expert, a better guest to have this conversation with. He is Tyronne Stoudemire, the SVP of Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for Hyatt Hotels Corporation, a globally recognized leader in the space beyond his current position at Hyatt, but in this area, been recognized multiple times by Black enterprise as a leader of diversity, but any number of media outlets, any number of institutions. We'll get more deeply into his background as we have this conversation. But this is one of the experts. I don't bring anybody on Beyond the Hype who can't really get beyond the hype to tell us what's really happening. So it's my pleasure as the host of the show. Welcome, Tyronne. Thank you for joining us, man.
Alfred, thank you for the wonderful introduction. I had to figure out, was you talking about me or somebody else? So thank you so much for the warm welcome. And I appreciate you and your leadership in keeping this dialogue alive and relevant for our subscribers today. I think it's having real dialogue and conversations and moving from being a passive bystander to a courageous or active bystander in the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Every leader that I've interviewed for this show, we're now going on in our third year, where they're a C-suite or senior executive leader in corporate America. I've talked to consultants who work outside but with corporations. And obviously we talk to the heads of ERGs who are obviously very engaged in this work in terms of what the employee experiences with is. And one of the common threads that you just mentioned is whether people are actually on the sidelines, almost being spectators and bystanders, or whether they're getting their hands deeply engaged in what's going on, both inside the corporate culture and the performance of the company, because it has to tie to corporate performance, but also outside, consumer facing. Obviously, you're representing a company in the hospitality industry. It could be argued that you can't get much more consumer facing than that on multiple levels in multiple markets. But talk to me as someone who has built a career and has established himself as a globally recognized leader in this space. What does it mean to establish a reputation in this space, you as an individual professional? What does it mean to make sure that your corporation actually wins? And winning is not just winning in DEI, but tying the wins to DEI to the larger performance of the company. I just want our audience to have a clear landscape of what it means to hold your position and how you measure your success.
Alfred, that's a very good question, a very long question, so I'll try to simplify it as much as possible. But I've been in this diversity, equity, and space for 30 years. And I've been a part of a marginalized group for almost 60. So I know what it's like to be treated differently. I entered into this space back when it was really called employee relations, right? People didn't really know it was about diversity, and very white and homogeneous organizations who really didn't know how to define it or really didn't know what it was, right? So I came at a time that it was just about, the evolution of DE&I started with compliance. Corporations who were Fortune 500 companies, who were public traded companies, were being compliant with the law. So they did things like give me 2 Asians, 3 Latinos, 4 blacks, and a few good white men and women, we'll be okay. But that created was polarization in the workplace, them against us, kind of a one up and a one down. Then it evolved that because the workforce was becoming more diverse, Then we had this whole tolerance and sensitivity a decade later, that we were training individuals on how to tolerate one another and be sympathetic to one another. But who wants to be tolerated? I'll tolerate that you're white, you're black, rich, poor, young, whatever, fill in the blank. And people walked out of that training, particularly white men walked out with white guilt. Women and people of color walked out, I'll never break the glass ceiling, the bamboo ceiling, the concrete ceiling. Again, another form of polarization. Then we moved into the third decade of doing this work was really around the business case. Corporations said, show me the money. If you can tell me how diversity is going to help me improve my bottom line, I'm all in. So organizations who had product consumers began to look at the spending and buying power of women and people of color, right? They began to kind of contextualize their advertising and their branding to meet the needs of those corporations. But all of them did not. Many of them did not understand the cultural context in which they were working from. You can't take white images and put black faces on white images and say we're committed to the black community. You can't. You look at some of the things that are because they've not had enough diversity in their organizations that have made major faux pas around being able to attract. So that the business case for the marketplace. There's 3 points. There's who we employ, develop, and advance. It's who we support, and who we buy from. Right? That marketplace is really going deep in culture. Remember, similar than we are different, but our difference lies in our cultural backgrounds, messages that were ingrained into us as children that we take in adulthood. And on the onset of children, our most informative years, when they go into the community, they see someone that's sleeping in the concrete, they stare. Someone in a wheelchair, they stare. Someone that has more darker pigmentation or speaks a different language, they stare. And we tell them it's not polite to stare. It's bad to stare. They're trying to figure it out. So in the onset, we told that. We grow up and we go into corporate America and we told not to talk about race, gender, orientation, politics, or religion, but also assume that something's wrong. So we somewhat has minimized diversity in our own workplaces and our own communities out of fear of having the wrong conversation, not diving deep and understand the cultural elements that blend us together. For example, love and admire McDonald's, but a few decades ago when McDonald's went to India, the first McDonald's was burned down to the ground. It wasn't they sold beef and chicken, they sold French fries, they fried the French fries in animal oil. So to regain their trust, they had to deal and got deep into culture. So if you were to Google McDonald's in India, you'll see McDonald's a family restaurant, right? For them to recover, they had to dive deep in the family. That logo doesn't exist anyplace else in the world. When you look
Wow.
at Chrysler cars back in the 70s in the United States, Chevy Nova was a real popular car for many. And they did really go. But when they expanded it in Mexico, Nova means won't go. Who buys a car that doesn't go? So not
Yes. Right.
understanding the cultural impact, not having a diverse team around the table will afford you to make major mistakes. We look at Goober Foods. In the United States, most of you get the beautiful blue-eyed baby with the fuzzy hair. Everybody, I sent my daughter's picture to be a Goober baby. Didn't quite make it. She was probably, didn't make it there. But when Goober Foods went to Africa and to Africa and Japan, the consumers were horrified with the packaging. It wasn't that the baby was white and blue-eyed. Their interpretation was what's in the box is what's on the box. Those mean Americans chopped up babies and put them inside the
Wow.
box. So not understanding those contexts, right, therein lies a challenge. Going back to today, during the pandemic, there was, I'm not sure if you saw, Alfred, the racist soap dispenser, where the soap dispenser would not just disperse soap on dark hands. And it was an African American and a white guy that goes into the washroom to show this test and posted on social media that went viral back during the height of the pandemic. When a black man put his hand under the soap dispenser, it didn't give soap. When the white man put his hand under, he got soap. He then put his hand back under, didn't get soap. Then he took a piece of white paper towel and it gave soap. So this isn't a Hyatt, a Hilton, a Marriott, or American Airlines issue. It's a manufacturer issue who did not control for color. So when we talk about diversity in the marketplace and how we show up, we have to have diversity around the table. We have to test products and services with a more diverse group, right, in order to really, really be productive in society. So we look at those examples about having diversity, and today, in 2020 and beyond, it's about moving from equality to equity, meeting people where they are, giving the tools to be successful, no matter what their race, gender, orientation, religion, ability, or disability. That work is real imperative. So the work has
You know,
evolved over time.
again, you're teaching a master class. I got to tell you, I mean, just the way you break down the evolution of what we now know as DEI, which obviously before 2020 nobody called it DEI, and you're
Right.
going through the different nomenclatures around this work. And again, you've been in this business in this function for 3 decades and counting. So that was just a great way to encapsulate it. There's a couple of things I want to pick up on that you raised. One of them, and it's been one of my ongoing things that I've been saying in these conversations, even in 2020. Let me back up. We now have seen reports, including most recently on NBC, that there's been a retrenchment in the diversity hiring space. Of the 4 C-suite positions that hiring was growing in 2019, only CDOs declined, according to LinkedIn's latest workforce report. And then we just see NBC's latest report talking about a 33% attrition rate for DEI positions, which is only 21% for non-DEI positions. And what I'm saying, I'm not necessarily even disappointed by that. What I said from the beginning is that you're going to have 3 different groups coming out of this environment in 2020. You're going to have companies that are well established, that have built this infrastructure, that even though this changed over time, they've had at least 15 years, and many companies longer, to understand the staffing needs, the integration into culture requirements. I always tell people successful diversity or DEI programs do not spring up overnight. So you get that first group, of which I'll say for you, I think Hyatt is one of those. So I wouldn't be having you on this conversation. Then you got this other group that is very well intentioned. They have laid some of the basic groundwork. They may have they have diversity initiatives. They but they really hadn't gotten up to the level of depth into the corporate structure to really be as fruitful, as impactful as was now being expected of them in the post George Floyd age. And many of those are the companies that you're seeing that kind of are retracting a little bit, because they can't necessarily produce the results that maybe they're being compared to with the more established, what I call legacy DEI companies. Then you have this other group, and we'll kindly call them the kind of performative group, that really did think it was just a matter of putting more Black people in the ads and donating more to Black organizations, and but really didn't understand. And so I guess what I'm trying to get to, and I'll let you as the real expert to talk a little bit about this, it is a learning curve.
Yep.
For corporate organizations. It's just not as simple as hiring a staff, putting together a budget, and telling them to be nice to everybody and make sure everybody feels like they belong. Talk to
Yep.
me a little bit about what you see in the larger landscape and what exists under your leadership that talks to infrastructure and culture change that would be the same even if you were going after a new market. Like you said, if you're going to go sell cars in Mexico, you better have some conversations around the culture and the operations of the company to make that effective. And I'm very, very familiar with that Nova fiasco in
Yeah.
terms of the case study.
You know,
But
and
talk
there,
to me
there,
about how
yeah,
this has to be just as much integrated into the culture as every other operation of the company.
right. I think that's a very good question, and I make it as simple as possible so people can grasp it and then take action. I look at it as 3 different components: the workforce, the workplace, and the marketplace. The workforce is where you're getting the talent from, and then how are you looking at your talent internally. I think that we have to look at and we have to lead with an evidence-based strategy, which leads with purpose and care, right? Culture will eat strategy for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Choose your meal. You can have the best strategy, but if you don't understand the culture of the organization and how it makes money and how it thrives and strives, your strategy is not going to work very well. So when you look at internally, you look at your talent by levels, determine how many people are in those levels and how long would it take for you to reach parity with men versus women and men versus people of color, right? And when you look by levels, and in most organizations, the higher up you go, the less diversity you see. So once you know where you are from a level perspective, you now can provide interventions and wonder what are the barriers and the pitfalls for women and people of color to advance in the organization. Because by 2025, the minority will be the majority and the majority will be the minority. And in 2025, the heterosexual white male living in suburban Illinois is going to be a minority. So we've got to look at this very differently to be able to figure out what is the strategies we have to put in place to advance talent a lot faster. There's 80 million baby boomers eligible for retirement. The next generation of workers are 40 million. There's a shortfall of 40 million qualified workers. And most companies will have opportunities not only of attracting talent, but retaining talent. Today it shows that blacks have 4 to 5 more opportunities than their white counterparts. So retention is going to be a real issue. So if you don't understand the business case for the workforce, therein lies the opportunity. Then you move to the workplace. Is what are the systems that are in place that are prohibiting people from growing? What policies and procedures that are riddled with bias that have been created for one popular person? I remember a leader telling me one time, "Well, Tyronne, we just have to play by the golden rule." Well, the golden rule was created by those who have the goal, right? You got to think about the time has changed. So we talk about
Right.
as simple as time off, bereavement time, right? Most organizations will say 3 to 5 days. 5 days if you're traveling, three. Now you now have mothers and fathers and aunts and uncles who you live with forever, and you want to capitalize, say it's only 3 days. Well, in some parts of the world, the bereavement process is 15 days. I grew up in Detroit, Michigan, and in Michigan, the ground gets so hard during the winter, you can't dig the hole because it's frozen. So there's a delay. So if we don't understand, right, those problems, those systems, we still see women getting paid less than men. We also know that women and people of color trust their employer going to do right by them. They're going to come to work, they're going to work hard, keep their head down, and trust that I'm going to be rewarded for my contribution, right? So my employer is going to do
Right.
right by me. So more likely not to advocate for promotions, most likely not to apply. I need more education. I need more experience. I want to wait till my children are out of college versus white men who will take the risk,
Right.
who will move forward in spite of. I may have 2 of the 10 things, but I'm going to get the rest of it over time. That's a confidence, there's a level, but there's a support to that. We are more likely in the workplace to work with people who are more like us, who look like us, dress like us, because we're comfortable. We're uncomfortable with the opposite. We're uncomfortable with difference because we've been taught that difference is bad, that something's wrong with difference. And then we move to the marketplace. Examples I gave earlier in the marketplace is that there was millions and millions of dollars impacted through McDonald's, Chevy Nova, through the soap dispensers, right? There was money that was lost and money that could have been made had they had a more diverse team to control for it. So when you look at how you show up in the marketplace, where you to go to recruit, what images do you have in front? People moving from photographs to more digital. So are you relevant in technology, right? What does your board look like? What does your C-suite look like, right? How do you see diversity throughout the organization? So that's kind of the evidence there. And I would say very clear, if there were not for Harriet Tubman, who was selling that bus, there would have not been a Martin Luther King. If there were not a Martin Luther King, there would have not been a Barack Obama. So every decade, there's been a disruption that most women and people of color have profited from, but the work still keeps going because it's not a destination, it is a journey. And it's going to take us time on that journey, and people come along the way. And along that journey, you're going to meet people such as innovators and early adapters. But most organizations have late adapters. They're individuals that are waiting to be told what to do. Also, in this new decade, under the George Floyd era, people have the will to do the work, they lack the skill to do the work. They want to do good, and they're willing to do good, but they don't know how. And many are afraid to lean in and lean forward because they don't want to be canceled from a social media perspective. They don't want to say the wrong thing. So they become very passive and withdrawed bystanders. For example, I was on a flight a few weeks ago, and a Caucasian female spit into the hair of an Indian woman. Just spit, right? It was just unheard of. You know how
Wow.
much it takes to spit at someone or to spit in
Wow.
someone's hair, right? And she thought that nothing was going to happen. She thought
Mm.
that it was okay. She operated from white privilege and white power. The flight attendants and the pilot have been people of color. There's a policy in place when someone harasses. So as they followed the policy, that young lady had no remorse. She had none.
Wow.
And the
Wow.
other piece that no one came to the rescue of the young lady, the like Indian woman. And being who I am and a practitioner and an extrovert, I leaned into the conversation, right? And so the police came, escorted her off. She was arrested, et cetera, right? But then I came back and I said, and asked, yeah, tell the young lady, you sit in my seat because I'm in first class. You sit here, trying to make her feel more because she was scared to death. She didn't know what to do.
Oh yeah.
I did not want her to go back and where she sat. Someone could have been with her or could have been upset because the flight now has been delayed for 2 hours.
Wow.
And I went back and apologized to the crew, and I said, I have, on behalf of the president and the flight attendants and the pilot, we apologize for the disruption and the delay. But what you just witnessed was white privilege at its best. And for those who sat here and said nothing and did nothing, what if that was if what was that with your mother, your daughter, or your wife? How would you expect someone else to speak up? People began to, applaud and to say, you know what, I never thought about that. You're right. They were passive bystanders that should have stepped up and stepped into that conversation. Now, I'm not saying putting yourself at risk, but it could
Right.
be no more than standing there and aiding the woman and making her feel comfortable if you're not willing to chastise. So until we get
Right.
people to that place of stepping in, and I looked at it as empathy plus action equals care. Being empathetic enough to walk in someone else's shoes. Many of us do not have enough courage to bend over and put them on, let alone walk in
Right.
them. And we don't want to take action because we're fearful that something is going to happen, right? And so again, I say this evolution is going to take time. I don't think we're going to right this wrong until 2030. It's
Right.
going to be with
Right.
us until we get enough courage to really rid the issues, just of the bias that we all have. We all have bias.
Well, see, you bring up a very important point, which is why I'm happy to have you on this conversation. You're right. Sometimes major change because an extraordinary individual does something to disrupt. You mentioned, like whether it was Rosa Parks or Barack Obama. Sometimes it's because something happens to disrupt. The murder of George Floyd being an obvious one. But in between, there's the work of people like you in your position, and it becomes excellency in practice over time that moves the ball when nobody's really watching the ball move. I always tell you the best work is not done when either there's a huge win or there's a horrible occurrence like a woman having her hair being spit in. It's the
Right.
work in between that creates the culture that lays the groundwork for these exceptional, whether it's positive or negative, disruptions that may spark progress or may spark a setback. And that's why, when people have all these conversations, including on social media, about, like you said, there's like, cancel culture and who's good and who's bad in corporate America, who's good. And I'm always like, I want to talk to the people who have to actually work day to day on this. And obviously, you have decades of working on this. You mentioned the keys that everybody who understands DEI or diversity mentions, the four key measures of whether a corporation is succeeding or not: board representation, senior management representation, uh, overall workforce representation, and relationship with suppliers, supplier diversity. And I always tell people it's very easy for those to be the four measures because real diversity practitioners want stuff you can measure. It's about metrics. Yeah, it's nice to see people a rainbow coalition in the advertising. It's
Sure.
very nice. It's very good. There's nothing wrong with it. But corporations is about performance. And the other thing I want you to weigh in on before we kind of go deeper into your experience with what Hyatt Hotels is doing, particularly with the Black consumer market, is the one consistent theme. And I don't want you to agree unless you see the same thing that I've heard from everybody I've talked to in this space since 2020 is that the big difference, and I think you kind of hinted on it earlier, but I want you to go deeper if you see a reason to, is that prior to the tipping point of George Floyd, like I think you did mention it earlier, people rather say nothing rather than get in trouble. It was easier to just, you know, and what I've heard both from Black people in corporate America and non-Black people in corporate America was for the first time, and I still think it's the case, but certainly in 2020 and 2021, everybody felt like at least I can say outright, whether I'm white, Black, or otherwise, this is what I see, this is what's happening, this is how I feel, and it had a not an easy effect, but a cathartic effect on the efforts to try to make things change. And you can't make change if, for the sake of this conversation, a white man feels like he can't say anything without getting in trouble, or he can't say anything without being, labeled. He can't,
Yeah.
and the ability to have honest conversation, of course, in a control, again, people in your space created safe spaces for these conversations to take place. But I was told that was like a major turning point in the DEI evolution, to be able to have conversations, intersectional conversations, because somebody who's black and gay may have issues that's different from someone who's black and straight. I've been very passionate about paying attention to what's happening with the differently abled community. One of
Yes.
my guests on the show is a black woman who's a paraplegic, who's a major champion of diversity in that space. But just tell me what you're seeing. I mean, this idea that at least we can say what it is, and because you can't even have the conversation if people are afraid to say what they see and how they feel.
Alfred, you're spot on. I constantly remind people that, and I'm not minimizing anything that I'm about to share with you. You had Black Lives Matters, the death of George Floyd, Asian hate, the Me Too movement, and the disrespect and the harassment in the transgender community, all at the same time. Literally, were
Right.
back to back to back. So none of us were exempt in that category. The fastest growing demographic by 2025 is going to be multicultural households. So you now have white men and women who have biracial grandchildren in which they love,
Right.
right? So the game is
Right.
going to change. With George Floyd, you had white people who had white employees, I mean, black employees that reached out, I just want to make sure you're okay. So you start seeing
Yes.
evidence of that happening, or neighbors. And in some cases, you know, George Floyd was not the first and will not be the last black man that was killed. We were numb, right? We were
Yes.
like, we see this all the time. But because of the pandemic and the conditions the pandemic put people in, they saw that literally on live television, right? Because in times past, well, all he had to do was sit there and resist. He should have resisted. They could make those excuses, but you saw
Mhm.
that play out on national television. So I often refer to the little teenager that was standing there with her phone, who videotaped it, was our Rosa Parks during the George Floyd situation.
Yeah, that in my word, that I mean, she's the hero. Again, she didn't get into all the headlines,
But
but that
she,
was the act of courage that
yes,
really
she
triggered
knew it was
everything.
wrong, and she recorded it. She had enough courage to not
Mhm.
be a bystander and walk away. She videotaped it so others could see. And so when you see those situations and you see people their culture being canceled, they're even more likely not to do anything and to stay neutral,
Right.
right? Because now people are so aware, you say the wrong thing, you can lose your job. You say
Right.
the wrong thing, you're going to be sued, right? And so when you have that there, bringing people in and creating mutual adaptation is going to be a little difficult. Creating psychological safety, safe place for people to talk, is these types of conversations you and I are having today. So I applaud you for what you're doing to bring this forward, because we have to have this dialogue, these courageous conversations, and be okay with, I'm learning, I'm growing, I am being vulnerable in the moment, right? Because every single day, some black transgender is being hunted down in the streets and being beaten or being bullied. Every day, there's an Asian person that's sitting on a bus trying to get home after working 18 hours a day, are being bullied. And black folks are still getting shot and killed in the streets, right?
Hey,
These are
well,
systemic issues that require systematic solutions to be able to change the status quo. So going back to the workplace, systems that are in the workforce, in the corporations, we just got to a very sophisticated way of managing our bias. It still
yeah,
exists. We've just ways around it. People say, I have a boss that I don't like the word bully. People are still bullying people in workforce. Bullying is come in different ways. So retaliation comes in ways. I'm not going to invite you to the next meeting. I'm going to not invite you to the dinner party. I'm going to make sure that you don't have opportunities to present. Those types of things still go on because of the bias that they have against other people for whatever reason it may be, right? We have got to overcome those issues and be clear on what the difficulties and the barriers are for advancing talent in our organization who happens to be black, who happens to be gay, who happens to have a different ability, right? Those
that,
kinds of things, I think, in place. So that systems piece is very, very important. And know that After the diet, we have to have those aha moments. We need to give each other feedback. The goal is to self correct and influence others and influence systems. That self correction came in after seeing the death and murder of George Floyd. And then people began to look at the systems that were stopping. You had Black Lives Matters on buildings and lights. You had posters and people were spray painting, so forth and so on. Right. And so you still have people there. I will say there were three defining moments for me with our CEO at Hyatt. One, we're a
Mm-hmm.
purpose driven organization. Our purpose is to care for people to be their best. And we had our top leaders meeting. He says, if you cannot subscribe to our purpose to care for people, I invite you to leave. Then the
Right.
second defining moment for me was that he said, we will not allow hate groups to convene at our hotels. Now they can stay, but they can't have meetings where they're a supremacist group against gays, white, blacks, whoever it may be. We put our colleagues and guests at risk. We're not going to allow you to do that. And he stood firm, and it's been almost, I would say, 5 to 7 years. And then last but not least, Black Lives Matters to me in this country. It's just a matter of you. I invite you to leave. When leaders make those types of stance and stand behind it, even though we would have lost. People said, "I'm not staying at your hotel anymore. I'm not supporting you anymore." He never wavered. His leadership team never wavered. And a
Tyrone,
part of that
perfect
is because
transition.
we have a very diverse leadership team. We got 3 women
Right.
and 3 men, and then we have the extended leadership team that has diversity. So when you have that diversity of thought, that diversity of how empathy shows up, and all of our senior leaders are executive sponsors of our diversity business resource groups. Opposite of the groups, intentionally and deliberately, to build what we call cross-cultural competence. So we have two heterosexual white men leading our Hyatt Black DBRG. We have two heterosexual white women leading our Pride DBRG. They're growing and learning together. We're also an agile organization where we believe in testing and learning. We're going to do things. We're going to stumble. We're going to fall. We got to pick ourselves up, brush ourselves off, and get back in line. We have a global diversity, equity, inclusion council that our CEO is the chair and I am the co-chair. We have 5 people from each region to be able to serve on that council to ensure that we're relevant for those regions to advance the work. Because if you look at DE&I, women are global around the world, right? We have women around the world. But in the United States, it's race and gender.
Right.
Pride is
Right.
global. Disability is global. Veterans may not be, right? So you have to be able to hear what are the issues in those regions or barriers that are forcing us not to move forward is where we have to go.
You,
So
you have
companies either
eloquently
reacted to,
illustrated.
yes,
You have eloquently illustrated the both the simplicity and the complexity of creating and maintaining ever evolving infrastructure. And this is a perfect segue to we've talked about what the larger environment looks like. The history, first we talk about the history of this. Then we talk about the larger environment. Then we talk about the structural and cultural priorities that have to be taken into consideration. Um, but when all is said and done, it's not meant to be an academic or philosophical exercise. Then it becomes what do you do on the ground? You said some of the things based on what your CEO had, the stance that he's taken and the policies he's put in place. But talk to the Black enterprise audience in particular about what does that look like in terms of the things that Hyatt Hotels is doing now. I mean, I know you're doing things up at Martha's Vineyard, and it's important to understand that many of quote things that advance DEI don't have DEI slapped all over it. It's deeper than having the label. This is a DEI initiative or an event. But talk to me about some of the things that I know that Hyatt is doing that is very innovative in the space. Some of it is new stuff that you're trying, and some of which you know is tried and true. To really make sure that after the conversations, after the new policies, after the meetings, after the CEO directives and pronouncements, somewhere on the ground, like you said, in the workplace, in the marketplace, and in the workforce, and in the communities, there's something that's happening that says this is a company that's really committed to this, both for its shareholders, its employees, as well as to the community at large.
yep. But thank you. And as I said earlier, corporations either responded to the death of George Floyd or reacted. We responded with a
Mm.
program called Change Starts Here. That we had to look inward before we could look externally to the death and murder of George Floyd. We arrived at 3 goals under our Change Starts Here initiative. One, we employ, develop, and advance, that we would double representation of women and around the globe, and people of color within the United States in their respective groups at the VP level and above in our corporate offices, and at the general manager and leadership team within our hotels. These were not, we don't have any issues getting hourly workers and managers and directors. It was how do we diversify at the top ranks of the organization? And developing at the top ranks organization provides those individuals to lead, to create revenue, to create opportunities at a much faster rate than we have in the past because of the diversity of thought, how we show up, how we behave, and relationships we bring to the table. And our second goal was who we support. We have committed to hiring 10,000 youth globally by 2025 between the ages of 16 and 24 whose qualifications are unemployment and no education. We have track record to show that in our environment, people have gone from bellmen to front desk to food and beverage to general managers. We have senior leaders in our corporate office that started as bellmen. So we have wonderful track record to advance people because everyone's not going to go to college. Everyone's
Right.
not going to go for a 4-year degree. It doesn't make them a bad person or doesn't say that they don't need an opportunity to move forward. We then had the next goal was out of our foundation. And let me just pause and just say I want to give a shout out to our chairman of the board, Tom Prickster, and our CEO, Mark Albanesium, that forego their salary to fund the foundation to give our colleagues grants because nobody was staying in hotels.
Right.
Right. We didn't have the opportunity to write checks like many technology firms and banks, and that was great. That was what they were able to do. But we were losing revenue because nobody was staying in hotels because of COVID.
Right. Right.
Right. So it was like,
Yeah.
okay, what can we do? We did things. So then we decided that we would give 1,000 pro bono hours back to the community, particularly the Black community, who was suffering the most with loss of their businesses and loss of their homes and could not, do work. We provided that, and it got viral. Our hotels opened up in Atlanta, Georgia. The GM opened up his rooftop and invited Black barbers to come and cut hair because of social distancing. We opened up our hotel lobbies and invited youth who could not go back home from college because they had no place to go to do their homework because of internet access.
Right.
We invited an African American male who does macaroni and cheese, has been cooking his macaroni and cheese and selling out of our hotel for 3 years. So we invited, opened up our kitchens, opened up our lobbies, opened up our roofs to be able to help them. We have an African American female out of Baltimore that sells bamboo toilet paper. The toilet paper is so good until our guest is stealing it off the cart.
Wow.
We actually signed her, gave her a 2-year contract, and paid her early so she could continue to do the work. We had
Right.
we had two females that has a farm in Atlanta. They did produce. We opened up and gave them the region. They was like, Mr. Tyrone, I don't have a refrigerated truck. The employees at the hotel did a fundraiser and raised money to purchase a refrigerated truck for these two women. These are random acts of kindness that people need to see and experience that's going to show empathy plus care equals action. Those are
The
things
other
we've
thing
done.
about that, Tyrone, if I can interrupt you, is that it reinforces the culture that goes to the purpose of the company in the first place. And I always tell people, if you put in a policy that's in this area that points in this direction, but your culture points in the other direction, both of them are going to fail. And so what made me think of that is when you said it wasn't the senior executives in the corporate board that donated money for this woman to get her refrigerated truck. It was people so that shows you that it's deep into the culture when people say this is what Hyatt stands for. This is the kinds of things that we do. And so yeah, it starts top down, but that was just a very great example of how the action reflected what the company was meant to be about long before the words diversity, equity, inclusion were ever even thought of or invented. Because it
Exactly,
goes to the
Alfred.
core
I
of what
think you
the
said so.
company.
We're top down, bottom up, right? We go
Okay.
we go together. And what people don't know about Hyatt is that diversity, equity, inclusion has been a part of Hyatt's DNA since we opened up our first doors in Atlanta, Georgia, in 1967. It was the height of
Mm,
civil rights, where Dr. Martin Luther King was attempting to have a combined luncheon with blacks and whites, and every hotel told him no. And as they were digging the hole for Hyatt, he said, "I hope this hotel does right by us." And
Mm,
Sonola Clayton, who is his administrative assistant, who lives today, went in and met the general manager and brokered the deal. So Hyatt Atlanta, Georgia, was the first hotel downtown Atlanta, the highest building downtown Atlanta, the first hotel with glass elevators, and the first hotel with a revolving restaurant. Was also the first hotel to put blacks in management and invited MLK. So that's been a part of our DNA since its conception. So when we talked about being a purpose-driven organization, that our purpose is to care for people to do their best, diversity, equity, inclusion is the manifestation of our purpose and how it comes alive, right? And
mm,
so doing those things, we invite people when they check into hotels, they're not coming into our hotels, they're inviting us into their lives. So how we show up from a cultural perspective is relevant. We have in some of our hotels more than 57 different cultures with 50 different languages being spoke all at the same time. I believe that hotels, hospitals, and universities, which touch more diversity than any place else, if they get it right, if we get it right, others will follow because of the experience that they had. Maya Angelou says it best. I can apologize for what I say, I can apologize for what I do, but how I make you feel, right, is what we need to focus on. I'll never forget, this is a defining moment for me. I was at a conference and I was speaking on a panel discussion. And a gray haired white guy gives up. This question is for Tyrone. Now, there's about 500 white men in the room. They were all CEOs. I was the only one in the panel. He points to me and it says, Tyrone, if blacks don't like being in America, why don't they just go back to Africa? Alfred, I had an out of body moment. I rose out of my chair and I walked to the stage. This is tweetable. For those who are tweeting, it's a tweetable moment. I told him, you cannot return stolen merchandise.
whoa.
The audience went, oh, and I said, he said, no, I'm not being harmful. I just don't know if Black Lives Matter and they don't think this country doesn't fund Black Lives Matters. Go back to Africa. Again, you cannot return stolen merchandise. Allow me to explain to you that blacks were kidnapped, hoodwinked, bamboozled, thrown over in ships into the ocean, was brought here to this country, hung from trees, and beaten into submission. By show of hands, how many of you would trade places with black people knowing what they've experienced? Not one. This tells me you have the capacity to understand the equity issues that have been created. So let me go a little further. Let me talk with Margaret Burroughs told me a story from Operation Push about Monopoly. And imagine that we're playing this game of Monopoly. And imagine for 450 rounds, you collected $250 and I collected zero. And while you were collecting $250, you bought land. You bought railroads, utilities, you bought homes, converted to hotels. And the very first time I get my first $200, I land on Boardwalk. And because I can't pay you, I go to jail. I then roll the dice and I pull the chance card and it says, take a ride on the Reading Railroad, do not pass go, do not collect $200, and go to jail. So I'm now 500 years behind you, right? If we do not focus on equity, we will never catch up, at least not in my time. Now, he and I became very good friends. They've been able to help him and help him with his business to grow. And he's now doing wonderful things in the black and brown communities. And he's showing up very different. Oh, and by the way, his son is married to an Asian woman. He will be having biracial grandchildren at some point. So again, some of this is personal, but this is also a business imperative. And these are systematic issues that require systematic solutions to address the racial and bias issue that we have in this country, the United States of America.
You have said a whole entire word, Tyrone, several whole entire words. Listen, in the time we have left, I want to build on this idea. I kind of mentioned earlier, I think you underscored one, this is not an overnight process of building a successful DEI initiative. Two, it either requires tying it to the current culture and reinforcing the current culture of your business, or it might require changing the culture of your business, which is obviously not easy. Doable, but far from easy. What I kind of want to get your take on now, again, as a leader, as an expert, as a proven best practices practitioner in this space over the decades, what would you advise? And I'm thinking of a particular person. I won't say her name, who was one of the newly hired DEI leaders at a company that didn't have deep roots and a deep process, didn't have a deep history, couldn't go back to 1967 and Dr. King and
Mhm.
how that was in the DNA of the company. was being very well compensated, very well paid, was a great opportunity, but was truly concerned about what she could really accomplish given the lack of infrastructure.
Mhm.
And she came to me, basically asking, some of my advice as someone who talks to people like you all the time. And so I guess what I'm asking you is, you look at some companies, some of which are still sticking to it, and some of which are kind of pulling back, who don't have the advantage of Hyatt's DNA, or, don't have the advantage of, McDonald's DNA. I know some of the history of these businesses and how the evolution of diversity came about, and some of the tipping point events in those corporate stories. But they still want to make progress. But they're not starting at year 30. They're starting at year 2. And what would be your advice to companies and diversity leaders in those companies to get past these kind of formative years when it's easy to give up, easy to fall off, but if they stick with it, someday they will have a story to tell 10, 15 years from now in terms of their growth and evolution in this space?
So that's a very good question. And I go back to the simple basics. And I think it's
Mm,
that people want to do, they have the will, but they only know what they see. Most companies think that becoming DBRGs are the win all cure all. But if you don't
mm.
have members of those respective groups, right, you have to define
Right,
what
right,
diversity is. Diversity without inclusion leads to confusion because who you being inclusive with if you don't have diversity? So you got to be able to help them understand how do we as an organization define diversity? And then what is the business case for us as an organization on how we're going to gain the market share with talent and consumers? How are we going to outperform the competition? And the number one, what people need to recognize and say out loud, the number one commodity in most organizations are its people. So how you invest in people, develop people, and where you get people, how you attract people and retain people is critical to the success of the organization. We're only as successful as our people are. The other issue is that in most cases, CEOs are only staying about 4 to 5 years. I have the privilege and the blessing and honor to work with a CEO that's been here double digit years. So I'm not changing every 4 years. I'm not bringing a perspective in from another leader, right? So, one, you got to know the organization and you have to be able to tell them where's they leaving, right? Blacks spent $109 billion in travel in 2019. So it's imperative for us to meet them where they are. Essence Awards has been a part of Hyatt's DNA since it started 20 years ago. It's been at Hyatt Regency, Atlanta, and New Orleans, right? Girls Trip was filmed out of that hotel. It is an iconic hotel for blacks who just want to go because I want to see what Tiffany and Queen Latifah did that movie. I want to have my girls' weekend there. So we talk about the spending and buying power of women and people of color and members of the gay communities. The gay community is $1.4 trillion globally in travel. So when you can show people that they're leaving money on the table, they're more likely to engage. But if we tell them we just want to celebrate Taco Tuesday and Fried Rice Friday, they ain't in for it.
right, right,
Because at the
right,
end of the
right.
day, their stockholders and shareholders are asking them to how profitable you're going to be because I need a return on my investment.
Yeah.
Right? So you have to be able to know how the company makes money, where they're losing money, and where the opportunities are through DE&I. I'll never forget when I worked for we were dispute associates and we had a strategy, that we would increase reputation at the top level of the house, that we would be able to turn into a consulting practice, and that we would attract a certain type of investor. In 8 months, we achieved that goal. We did over $4 million in revenue, and our number one stockholder was Ariel Investment, where John Rogers and Melanie Hopkins, our CEO and co-CEO.
Yes.
So the headline is Hewitt, the world's largest human resource outsourcing consulting firm, number one stockholder is a black firm.
Yes.
That
Yes.
speaks volumes. Now,
That
here's
does.
the
That does.
breakdown. My CEO, Dale Gifford, God bless his soul, it's gone on to be with the Lord, became one of my big mentors, never knew who John Rogers Melton Hopkins was and never knew Area Investment. But once he
Mhm.
found out, we partnered, we looked for ways to be able to advance participation rate in 401k of women and people of color in the workforce. Because they had been looking at that data of helping to expose blacks to be able to invest so they could retire. We had the data, we partnered. So this is work that you have to partner with others to find out how to make money, how to increase money, how to gain the market share and talent to be able to help the consumers, no matter what it is. And those who have consulting firms now, the decision makers at the top of the house are different than the white men you worked with 10 years ago.
Hmm.
So if you don't understand, I'll never forget, there were strong allies in this work. Don Thompson was the president and CEO of McDonald's. When we worked at Hyatt, he mandated that we had someone of color on that team. When we came to consult about their benefits and their record keeping and pension plans and 401k, whatever it may be, he mandated that there was a black person on the team. They didn't think he was serious. And when they came back, they had all blue-eyed blonde men. And he says, you don't, and I know you got black people work there. You got Kevin Carrington, you got Sharon Hidalgo, you got Tyronne, because he knew who was
He
there,
knew them.
who was qualified to do the work. So we have to stick together, know, and be able to leverage our resources to be able to build that strategy. But it comes with building a psychological safety, environmental trust. And no, I learned from Roland Martin years ago. Every time I open my mouth, I take a risk of losing my job because I'm going to offend somebody or say something that they're not going to agree with. After the death and murder of George Floyd, had several white men and women come to me and apologize on how they treated me in the workplace, and they knew they discriminated, begging for my forgiveness. So
Wow.
again, this is not work. This is work of the heart. This is not easy work. This is not work for the weary. It's not just to get a big paycheck. You are actually helping to transform the organization to live out its mission, its values, and its promise to its consumers, whomever that may be. So finding allies, finding sponsors, finding the right consultant to come in. I served as a consultant. I was able to deliver messages to companies that the chief diversity officer couldn't deliver because she or she put
Right.
them at risk,
Right.
right?
Right.
So I go back to people have the will to the work, they don't have the skill. And we have to
I want,
create.
I want, I want you to dive in as we wrap up this conversation on this word. You said it at the top of the conversation. You've said it a couple of times during the conversation, and that's the word courage, which even just now, with just what you just shared, this is not for the faint of heart. This is not somebody looking for a way to kind of sail, serenely through their career or through their work. One of the pieces of advice I give to my mentees is I tell them that people who learn from their mistakes will always outperform people who never make mistakes. And I now can see that applying to corporations because again, once you start doing this work, and I am thinking of the companies that are new to this diversity space and who are now being tempted to pull back because they don't necessarily see the long-term goal. One of their fears is that if you don't have diversity, you can't make a mistake. But when you start doing diversity work, especially when you're new to it, and even if you're not, there's going to be mistakes. And the companies like Hyatt that have stood the test of time are the ones that say, "Yup, there's going to be mistakes. When we make them, what do we learn from them?" So the mistake is not a reason to pull back and to back off. It's a reason to say, "How do we learn and get better?" And that was the piece of advice I did give to my friend, that you got to look for the courage points in your company because guess what? Nobody gets it right at the beginning. And even when you get it right at the beginning, it's now we see it's a decades long journey. So talk to me about the points of courage for a lot of these new companies that are kind of at this crossroads. Do we keep going or do we pull back?
So in most organizations, in my experience in consulting and working in corporations, there's some disruption that needs to occur. In most
Mm,
organizations, HR is designed and created to protect and preserve the status quo, treat everybody the
mm,
same. Legal is often saying, not don't take the risk, right? There's too much risk here, so let's do nothing. Now, I'm not going to stereotype, I'm going to say this archetype, have a tendency to behave a certain way. In my situation, I had of HR, it's like, be disruptive, be kind, be courteous. Our legal counsel, let's take the risk. Let's push ourselves a little stronger. Let's operate for purpose and care. So, with purpose and care being our foundation, right, we're looking at it very differently, and it shows up differently, and it demonstrates our ability to care for people no matter who they are. So that's, but those who don't have it, they got to dive deep in why we're here, how we define diversity, what does inclusion look like? Companies now moving to a sense of belonging, primarily because in February of last year, more than 50 million people left their employer because they felt like they didn't belong. They
mm,
felt like they were not a part of. They felt, I say it to lighten the load, diversity being invited to the party, inclusion being asked to dance, and equity is dancing to my own music. People can see bringing people together because the more diverse we are, the more diverse opportunities that we have. You got to translate into dollar and cents. You got to show how you're going to gain the market share and retain the market share, whether it's in suppliers or the workforce. or consumers, right? You got to know how money is being made. You got to show where you're losing money. You're going to gain the people who are very analytical. You're going to gain the people who really want to do it because it's the right thing to do. There's many type of people in the net, and you have them
Mm.
all. You got to look for those who really get it and work with them. Most organizations have sales divisions understand that their customers have changed. They're more likely to be more inclusive so they can sell to the consumer, right? So you got to find out who are the strong allies in the organization that I can leverage that can be a voice. How can I
One of the
show
things.
that we're able to generate revenue by connecting it with my friends? I will tell you that the sororities and fraternities have showed up in a very good way at Hyatt, where they're using Hyatt, spending millions and millions of dollars. We're on this call today because my relationship with Bush Graves, we both sit on the American Airlines Council focusing on Black travelers. So I'm able to leverage and to bring him in to talk to how do we tell the message to the Black community that we're committed, right? And so Bush Graves and this entire team, we've been in this relationship for a year, and you've proven to show who we are and what we're doing to a community that may not would have never known otherwise. So relationships are important, due diligence are important, and this is not a 9 to 5. This is not a nine
Mm.
to five. I am on hour number 15 today with this call. I'm in a global role. My day could end at 10 p.m. and begin at 6 a.m., 7 o'clock. So you cannot hang your hat up at 5 o'clock and go home. You got to do the research. You got to understand the data. You have to interpret the data. You have to forecast the future. You have to get people to see that in order to gain the market share, we need to adjust by doing these things, right? Connect with consultants, connect with people doing the work. There's tons of literature that's out there. LinkedIn has wonderful library of suggestions on how to do things differently. There's organizations out there like LCW, Worldwide Language Academy, that have ongoing consultants. Organizations such as ELC, Executive Leadership Council, which is the highest ranking black folk in most corporations who are either CEOs or removed from the CEOs, has the largest gala in the country. It gives out millions of dollars of scholarships to black and brown people. Associations are important to be able to grow the business. If you're not in those relationships, you can't do it. And then the other thing is give yourself some grace.
Mm.
Know that you got to have time and effort to get this done. Don't always be about you got to look at the glass half full always, not half empty. Celebrate your wins, big or small. Our comps team, communications team, and PR team work collectively with me. I have a small team, but I'm embedding diversity with them in each of their practices, right? They go along for the journey. We're walking alongside each other in this journey, growing and learning together gives you a better result. You cannot do it by yourself. You can't go it alone. Find the allies for the work and grow together. In a world where we can be anything we want to be, I encourage people to be kind to themselves and kind to others.
Man, I got to say this as we wrap up the conversation. The fact that you have real passion for what you're doing, that's kind of the common thread we try to get on all of Beyond the Hype guests, that is not just knowledge and expertise and experience, but it's a real passion. It takes passion to say, oh, this is not just a 9 to 5. I work until the job is done to achieve the goal. Not, again, they just, I could talk for another hour, which is that's the other thing that happens with most Beyond the Hype guests. But I circle back as we wrap this up, and I thank you for being a guest on this show, to this mantra: change starts here. And what you've done is really kind of taught a master class of what it really means to be a change maker, in this case in DEI. But if you're doing it right, it's not just being in a limited silo, it's throughout an organization, throughout the industry, and ultimately throughout society. So, that change starts here mantra, I got to say, man, you are, you're not just talking the talk. You are walking the walk. You're a real evangelist for this concept.
I
I really
applaud
appreciate
and thank you for that, but I can't take that compliment independently. It is the
it.
people at Hyatt that I work with, from the leaders to the bellmen. I'll never forget our CEO asked me, he says, Tyrone, how do you know you're going to be successful with this? I said, when everyone in the organization can talk about change starts here and know what it means, we're successful. I go to Atlanta, Georgia, to the Hotel of Hope, and we have a doorman. His name was Mr. Woolley, had been with us many years. I think Mr. Woolley was probably 80 years old. I get out of the car, he said, Mr. Tyrone, change starts here. If the
Yeah.
bellman and the doorman can say change starts here, we have arrived. right?
Yes.
Now, I'm not saying
Yes.
we got work to do, but we've been able to
Mhm.
keep it, and we have a 5-year goal. The first 2 years is building confidence that we can get this done, sharing ideas, testing and learning, right? Putting together focus groups and agile pods. All that stuff was going on. And here's the deal: people were excited about it. It got real it was really kind of friendly competition. They were outbidding each other. They were doing career fairs uh, for vendors and bringing them in and celebrating them. We now have we're launching champagne with Isaiah Thomas, right? We're having Uncle Emos or Ermos. I'm gonna get the name wrong. I apologize. His brown liquor, Duke and Dane,
Oh,
all these things.
Uncle Nearest. Uncle
Uncle Nearest,
Nearest.
right? Thank you.
Yes.
Uncle Nearest
Yes.
and Duke and Dane, these are things that's in our hotels. Duke and Dane in Miami, the general manager, Amy Johnson, has a liquor in her bar, but her chef took the liquor and made a dessert out of it. He took that concept over to MGM, now has international account with MGM. Right? Those are the kinds of things we have to be able to continue to do for one another and stand in the gap, right? So that everyone can benefit at the end of the day. We're not competitors in this space. Whatever I have in place, I'm happy to share. I'm happy to mentor and to really guide people along the process. But it really starts with, do you care enough? Are you courageous enough? And how you communicate this message is to bring people along to be a part of this wonderful journey of diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Wow, that's the perfect final word. Tyronne, thank you so much for being so generous with your time, your expertise, your insights, and most importantly, your lived experience as a guest on Beyond the Hype. Thank you for being my guest on the show.
Alfred, thank you for what you do and bringing these conversations to light with others, and keep up the good work, and look forward to working with you soon.
No doubt. Well, you know how we do it here. That's another great edition of Beyond the Hype. This episode of Beyond the Hype is being brought to you by Hyatt Hotels. I'm Alfred Edmond Jr., Senior VP, Executive Editor at Large at Black Enterprise. Please take care, and we'll see you next time.